Hi, welcome to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith, and in this video, we're going to learn the 1 to 6 player game, Flashpoint Fire Rescue, designed by Kevin Lansing and published by Indie Boards and Cards. When you get the call, there's no time to hesitate. A home is on fire, and you and your team need to respond quickly and effectively, saving the citizens inside and their pets, and then getting out before the whole building collapses. So join me at the table, and let's learn how to play. Flashpoint Fire Rescue has two main modes of play, the family and the experienced versions. We're going to learn the family mode here, and in a future video, we'll cover the experienced rules. This double-sided board depicts two different buildings, and you can play on either, but it's recommended that you use this side for your first game. These double-sided door markers are then placed closed side up on each of these spaces found inside the building that depict two cubes. It should look like this once they're all placed. These are threat markers. They show fire on one side and smoke on the other. 10 of them should be placed fire side up into these spaces as I've done here, which matches what it shows in the rulebook. These question marks are double-sided point of interest tokens. On the other side, some will show victims, while others will show blank false alarms. During setup, return to the box 2 victims and 1 false alarm. From those that remain, shuffle them question mark side up into a stack and then place 3 of them, as I've done here, into these spaces. The remaining points of interest, threat, and these action point tokens should be placed nearby, along with these damage markers and the 2 dice. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to keep these components off screen and just bring them out as required. Each player chooses one of the 6 differently colored firefighting figures and takes the matching colored card, which they'll place in front of themselves as a reminder of which firefighter they are. In this video, we're going to set up for a 2-player game. Players now place their figures onto any spaces outside of the building, and you can share the same space with another player if you want. The youngest person at the table is then declared the first player, or you can choose randomly. And that's the setup. In Flashpoint Fire Rescue, players will be working together to fight fires and try to save at least 7 victims before the building collapses. The game is played over a series of turns, starting with the first player and then going clockwise around the table. And on your turn, you'll complete 3 steps, starting with Take Action. You'll have 4 action points to spend, which you can assign to any of the possible actions listed here on the included player aid. Actions printed in yellow are only available in the advanced mode of the game, so they can be ignored for now. You can perform actions in any order, and you may repeat the same action as long as you can pay its listed cost each time. So let's take a moment now and go over each of the possible actions. A move action lets you move your firefighter to an adjacent space, and you can always pass through open doors like the one that we see printed here permanently on the outside of the building. However, you cannot move diagonally, so these are not considered adjacent, and neither are spaces that are separated by a closed door or by a wall, unless that wall is destroyed. We'll see later that walls are considered destroyed once they have 2 damage cubes on them. So in this situation, our firefighter could now move to this space. Keep in mind, while moving, you can share spaces with any number of other firefighters. It costs 1 action point to move into a space that doesn't contain fire. So entering the building like this cost us 1 action point, and then moving here would cost 2 more. If the space you're entering contains fire, it costs 2 action points. However, you may never end your turn on a fire space, so ensure you have enough action points left over to leave that space before you go into it. Later, we'll see how smoke can be added to the board, and entering a space with smoke costs 1 action point, and you can end your turn there. Anytime you enter a space with a point of interest marker, immediately flip it over to reveal either a victim or a false alarm. If it's a false alarm, this represents a noise or object you thought may have been a victim, and you then place it onto this rescue space of the board, but it will not count as one of the 7 victims that you need to save. If instead a victim had been revealed, players will want to help them escape the building. Victims will not move on their own, but by spending 2 movement points, you can move to a space without fire and bring the victim with you. Although you can't bring a victim into a space with fire, you can move them into a space with smoke. If you carry a victim outside of the building, then you've saved them. Let's say, for example, the blue player spent their first 2 action points to carry the victim here, and then the remaining 2 action points to carry them outside the building. They'd place the citizen here into the rescued area, and this would then count as one of the 7 survivors they need to rescue. And that covers the movement action. For one action point, you can flip an adjacent door marker. This opens the door, allowing players to move through it when they use their move action. You can also spend an action point to close a door by flipping it again. Action points can also be spent to target smoke or fire tokens that are in or adjacent to your space. For one action point, you can flip a fire marker to its smoke side. You can also spend an action point to remove a smoke token from the board, or spend 2 points to remove a fire token altogether. Need to get through a wall or make a quick exit? For 2 action points, you can take the chop action to place a single damage marker on a wall that you're adjacent to. This is now considered a damaged wall, and you can't move through it yet. However, once you place a second damage token on it, it's considered destroyed, and now firefighters and fire can pass through it. So those are the actions. However, a player is not required to spend all of the points that they have. If you wish to stop early, you instead gain an action point token for each action point you didn't spend. So if the blue player only spent 1 action point on their turn, they would then collect 3 of these action point tokens. At most, you can have 4 of them at the end of your turn. But then, on future turns, you can spend them as you like in addition to the usual 4 action points you always have. Either way, once a player has taken their actions, they then perform the next step, advancing fire. They'll now roll the dice and use that to determine the space where they place a smoke token. The black die represents the columns and the red die, the rows. So in this case, we've rolled column 4, row 2, which targets this space. If the space is empty, you just place a smoke token there. But if the targeted space already contains smoke, then you flip it to its fire side. Keep in mind, if a space is set on fire that contained a point of interest token, it is flipped over and placed on this lost space of the board, meaning the victim was not rescued successfully. Let's say instead we'd rolled a 5 on the black die. If smoke is being placed adjacent to fire, it is instead placed on its fire side. Remember, 2 spaces are not considered adjacent if there's a wall or a closed door between them. So if we had instead rolled a 6, even though there's fire here, this would get placed as smoke because a closed door is between them. Finally, if the new smoke token would go into a space already containing fire, an explosion occurs instead, radiating in all 4 directions at once, up, down, left, and right. If there's a wall bordering the space in one of those directions, place a damage marker there. If there's a door, like this, instead, destroy it. This wall is now permanently open, but no cubes are placed there. Instead, 2 cubes are permanently printed here to remind you that this acts exactly like a destroyed wall. If one of the adjacent spaces is empty, place a fire token there. If instead there had already been a smoke token here, simply flip it to the fire side. You'll always follow these instructions even if it would mean placing fire outside the building. If an adjacent space during an explosion already contained fire, a shock wave occurs. Continue following in that direction until you either get to an open space, a smoke space, a wall, or a closed door. If you come to a wall, like we do here, then you place a damage token on it. If this wall had already been destroyed before the shockwave occurred, then when we resolved the shockwave, following in this path, we would have come to an empty space. In that case, you'd place a fire token there. If the shockwave had instead ended in smoke, then that smoke token would get flipped over to fire. If a shockwave ever encounters a closed door, as we saw here, you simply destroy the door. One final thing I want to mention about explosions is that a shockwave will freely travel through an open door into the next space, but you then also destroy the door that it passed through. So as a final example, let's make sure we understand how explosions work by pretending that during the advanced fire step, the player rolled this space. Instead of placing smoke here, because there's already fire, an explosion would occur. We have an adjacent wall, so this would become damaged, and then all 3 of the other spaces already have fire in them, so shockwaves will head off in those directions. The shockwave in this direction encounters a closed door, which will be destroyed. Going in this direction, we encounter an empty space, so we'll place fire. And we also find an empty space going in this direction, passing through the open door, so we'll place fire here. The door will be destroyed, the point of interest will be immediately revealed, and because it's a victim, we'll now send it to the lost space. After advancing fire and resolving any explosions, you will now flip any smoke tokens to their fire side if they're directly adjacent to fire. And this could cause a chain reaction, as we'll see in the example that I've set up here. We have a firefighter who's carrying a victim. We also have a point of interest, a lot of smoke, and fire in this corner. Now these 2 smoke tokens are adjacent to the fire, so they'll flip over. And then the smoke token here is now adjacent to fire, so it will also flip. causing this smoke to also flip. And now, because it's fire, we'll have to reveal this point of interest token. And unfortunately, it's a victim. It will now go into the lost space. After all the required smoke has been flipped over, you'll now check the board for firefighters in spaces with fire. These are considered knocked down and will now be placed in the closest ambulance parking space, assuming that you traveled in a perfectly straight line. Ambulance parking spaces are these blue ones that we see on the outside of the building. Now, if two spaces are equally close, then the player can choose which one they want to travel to. And if they were carrying a victim, it's left behind, and because it's in a fire space, it is also lost. A knockdown player will take their actions as usual on their next turn. They've just been slowed down and will need to get back into the building. After completing the advanced fire step, the last step of a player's turn is to replenish points of interest. If you have less than 3 of those tokens on the board, including ones that have been revealed, so in this case we have 2 tokens, you'll add new ones until there's a total of 3 present on the board again. So we need to add 1 more. To determine its placement, we'll roll the dice. And let's say we rolled a 1 and a 7. We draw a new one from the stack and place it in that space. And if there's a firefighter there, we immediately reveal it. Now, if it had been a victim, that would have been a pretty lucky roll. On the other hand, if it's a false alarm, you simply remove it from play. You'll then need to re-roll the dice and add a new point of interest. So let's say after rolling, this time we had a 2 and a 3. If the point of interest would go into a space that has smoke or fire, remove it first for free. Now your turn is over and the next player in clockwise order takes their turn, and so on. As soon as the players have rescued 7 victims, they don't need to finish the current player's turn, they immediately win. Or you can keep playing, trying to rescue all 10 victims for a perfect game. As soon as 4 victims have been lost, the players immediately lose the game. Also, if all 24 of the damage markers have been placed on the board, the building is said to be too weak and it collapses, sending all victims to the lost space, and again, the players lose. And that's everything you need to know to play Flashpoint Fire Rescue using the family rules. If you want to learn the experienced rules, which include special roles for the players, ambulances and fire engines, and other components, we'll have a link to that in the description of this video. But if you have any questions about anything that you saw here, don't hesitate to put them in the comments below and I'll gladly answer them as soon as I get a chance. But until the next episode, thanks for watching.